Welcome to Sober Mentum Today, where we discuss middle-of-the-road drinking and how trying out an alcohol-free lifestyle might just help you show up as a better version of yourself for your life, your loved ones, and every endeavor that matters to you most. I am your host, Morgan Smith, and today's topic is the secret to moderating your drinking. But before we get started, I'd like to offer you a helpful tool if you've been questioning your drinking, which can be a very healthy thing to do, by the way, or wondering if you should cut back. You can find out exactly where you stand on the alcohol drinker spectrum by clicking the link in the description box below and downloading the free info guide. Now, on to our topic. So, among those of us who have sort of arrived at a point where we're drinking a little more than we want to, and we're questioning the role that alcohol has come to occupy in our lives, there's, I think, a common theme that I've seen over the years, and this was something I observed in myself, but also in lots of other folks that I came across, whether on message boards online or just hearing about them, maybe folks who were wrestling with their drinking being interviewed on a podcast or what have you. And I see this common theme amongst the clients that I work with today as well, and that is a really strong desire to be able to kind of rewind their drinking habit back to a point of when they were able to moderate, quote unquote, such as in the very early stage of their drinking career. And it's almost like a holy grail. We sort of, like, we know we're drinking more than we should, we know we're drinking more than we want to, or maybe a little bit concerned about the direction it could go in if we keep on our current pace. So we want to dial it back. And it's very natural for us to have that desire, and it's healthy, quite frankly. And typically we'll begin with, kind of implementing some rules or some boundaries for ourselves. Hey, I'm gonna take weeknights off. I'm only gonna drink on the weekends, or I'm gonna have, a glass of water in between each drink, or I'm going to, only drink beer or wine, but no liquor, like whatever it is. We all sort of try this. It's very logical to attempt, to sort of mitigate things and rein it in. However, a lot of us discover that this proves to be an elusive goal, at least consistently. And so today I'm going to tell you the secret to moderating your drinking. And you may not like the secret, you may not like the answer that I share, but let's set it up first, kind of set the stage, and then we'll get into what exactly that secret is. Okay, so the first order of business before we get into this topic is to understand if you're at the point where you're trying to moderate your drinking and you're finding it, a little more difficult than you anticipated. We first want to understand where you fall on the alcohol drinker spectrum. And I mentioned this at the very beginning of this video, and I mentioned the link in the description box below where you can go download your copy. And there's also an extended video tutorial that goes into much further depth about it. But I'm going to go ahead and throw the drinker spectrum up on the screen for a brief moment here so you can kind of see what it looks like. And I'm not going to go too deeply into it today, other than to just point out that there are essentially three factors that go into your personal score, if you will, around your drinking and where you fall in the alcohol drinker spectrum. Okay, the first of those is what I call affinity for alcohol. Okay, that's your unique affinity for alcohol. Okay. Now, the tricky part about this component of the three that make up your total score is that it's really outside of your control. Okay, each of us sort of has this unique, sort of fingerprint, and it's part genetic. Okay, so we each have an individual predisposition for how likely we are to like alcohol beyond, or to unhealthy levels, to become overly fond of it. And this has to do with how fast and rapidly and efficiently our body can process alcohol. That's a big part of it. And so you can often see this sort of genetic trait that can run through families. However, don't mistake no drinking history or problem of drinking history in your family as meaning that you're all in the clear. Okay, because alcohol is a psychoactive, habit-forming substance. That's according to the World Health Organization, which means anybody can get addicted to alcohol. It just means that some of us have a higher risk for that outcome than others. Okay, the other side of the coin for your unique individual affinity for alcohol is environmental. So, how alcohol was treated, what you sort of absorbed and witnessed growing up in your household, your immediate family's treatment of alcohol, what you saw, role modeled for you, sort of growing up, but then also the larger circles of your culture, your country, sort of how alcohol, the social conditioning around it. So those two factors, really, you can't really control either of those. You didn't really have a say in what country you were born in or what that country's attitudes were about alcohol when you were a child, and you similarly didn't choose the family you were born into. And you definitely didn't choose your genetics. None of us did, any more than you chose your eye color or your hair color. So it's just there. Okay, so that's the first factor of the three with respect to where you stand or I stand or anyone does on the alcohol drinker spectrum. Okay, the second component is your consumption levels. And this pertains to both the quantity of alcohol that you drink and the frequency. So if you're someone who drinks one drink every 6 months, okay, then you are very low on this scale. And by the way, I should have mentioned, let me just clarify. The affinity for alcohol scale, I rate that on a scale of 1 to 4. So, sorry to back up on you here, but real quick, on that scale of 1 to 4, somebody who's a 4 would be someone with a very high propensity genetically and environmentally that's highly predisposed to being overly fond of alcohol. Whereas someone who is only a 1 would be someone who probably is very unlikely. It just doesn't have the same appeal to them. I think we can see this with respect to certain other things in life. Sugar, for example. We refer to some people as having a sweet tooth. So there's some people for whom the pleasure that they derive from eating a piece of cake or a cupcake or a cookie or a piece of candy is far greater than someone else. Like I don't have a particularly strong sweet tooth, so like candy and sweets as much as the next person, but it doesn't have the same draw to me. I mean, I could go weeks, heck, maybe even months without eating any candy or anything. It's just, I do like ice cream. That's kind of my weakness. But that aside, point being, I think it's easy to see that some of us have a much higher level of fondness and attraction to the effects of certain substances or foods or what have you than others. Okay, so that's affinity for alcohol. Moving back over to what I started to speak on with respect to consumption levels. So that scale is from 1 to 10. So if you're someone who, like, as I mentioned, is drinking only one drink every 6 months, like you're a 1. Okay, that's a very, very low consumption level. Conversely, the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're a 10, well, 10 is you're probably, this is what we would use in slang vernacular. We would describe as alcoholic or alcoholism. This is somebody who's probably well beyond 10 drinks a day, may very well be in the 20, even possibly 30 drinks a day territory. Okay, full scale physical and psychological dependence. Okay, that's a dark place to be. I hope you're not there. Thankfully, I never got that far. I want to say, probably about a 6, moving toward a 7. And I just didn't like it. I got to the point where the effects and the downsides and, some of the consequences, even though they're maybe mild by some people's standards, I just got fed up and tired of it. Okay, so that's the second component is the consumption component, again, on that scale of 1 to 10. Okay, the third aspect of where you sit on the alcohol drinker spectrum is time. Okay, how long have you been in this cycle of over drinking? How long have you been in this state? Maybe you've been drinking for 20 years, but maybe it only really ramped up in the last 5 or 6 or 10. Okay, so if you or if your drinking has peaked, but only within the last few months, maybe because you're going through a really difficult life chapter for whatever reason. Okay, that can be dialed back more easily than someone who's been on this sort of overconsumption train for a really long time. Okay, but so to summarize, we each have a score on the alcohol drinker spectrum that's composed of our individual affinity for alcohol, our consumption level, and the amount of time that we've been at that higher consumption level, or lower consumption level for that matter. So as an example for myself, I'd say my affinity for alcohol on a scale of 1 to 4 was about a 3. Okay, I am, descended from people from Western Europe and Northwestern Europe. I'm of Norwegian and British and Scottish and Irish heritage. And there's a whole lot of drinking that goes on in that part of the world. Okay, so people from that genetic lineage, a lot of them, not all of them, but there's a higher degree or ability of processing alcohol rapidly and efficiently, perhaps more so than people from other parts of the world. But again, I don't want to stress this genetic component too much because there are still individual factors. It doesn't mean everybody of my exact ethnic identity is of the exact same risk level. It just means it's a factor. So, like I said, I think I'm about a 3 out of 4 on that scale. I was about a 6 on the consumption level. And I ran the numbers this morning. I looked back at it. I think it was about 9 years that I was at a higher level of drinking than I had been in my earlier days, back in my 20s, for example. So a 3, a 6, and a 9. How about that? And now, for the moment you've been waiting for, the secret to moderating your drinking. Well, here it is. Be really, really low on all 3 elements of the alcohol drinker spectrum. Okay? If you're a 1 on the affinity for alcohol scale, which, by the way, you didn't choose that, but if you are, congratulations. If your consumption level is extremely low, you drink rarely, and even when you do drink, it's very little. And, in terms of years, well, the time factor isn't even as critical for you if you're down in that bottom end of the spectrum, because there's no chance of the neural adaptations really taking root because your frequency of consumption and your quantity of consumption is so low. So if you're to the point where you're trying to moderate your drinking and you've decided that you want to make an effort to rein it in, to dial it back, to make some rules for yourself, establish some boundaries, I have news for you. And you may not want to hear this news. Lord knows I did not want to hear this news. I fought against it tooth and nail. But if you're at the point where you're already trying to moderate your drinking, that means you're far enough along on the alcohol drinker spectrum that the neural adaptations have already taken root. And what that means is moving backwards down the scale is damn near impossible. Okay? Now, there may be some exceptions, very few and far between. Okay, the only thing I can think of is maybe if you have a person who has a low affinity for alcohol on that scale of 1 to 4, let's say there may be a 1 or 2, and they have a temporary period of life where their drinking skyrockets. Maybe they're just going through a really difficult time. Maybe they are going through a relationship problem. Maybe they went through a divorce. Okay, this actually happens a lot. People go through divorce and their drinking spikes because they're using it as a coping tool. Okay, another example that comes to mind is a young person goes away to college or university and they just, party their head off for the handful of years that they're at school. But then they graduate, they move on into, responsible adult living, and they dial it back. Okay, they rein it in back to, so-called moderate consumption levels. So what I would contend is that someone who's able to do that, or in the prior example, someone who's going through a difficult life chapter where they're drinking peaks for some period of time, but then they rein it in. And by the way, I know a couple of people in my life who've been through this scenario. And knowing them, and now knowing them years after this peak drinking episode in their life, what I've come to conclude is that both of them have a relatively low genetic and environmental affinity for alcohol, and also the time factor for this peak period of their drinking was relatively short. In both of these people's cases that I'm thinking of, it was probably less than a year, and even in the case of the university student that I mentioned, that could even be a few years away at school drinking too much. But if you've been in a situation where, like I had mentioned myself, 9 years, my drinking was above average levels for 9 years. It was never crazy high. I was at, like I said, about a 6 on the consumption and frequency scale, which means I was drinking roughly 30 drinks a week. Okay, most nights it was 4 drinks. Weeknights, on the weekends it might be 5 or 6. So in that 30, maybe on a really high week, 35 drinks. Okay, so, and I did that routine for about 9 years, 8-9 years, before I pulled the plug and decided to take a sober vacation, which you can learn all about on my website, sobermentum.com. Shameless plug alert. But the point here is ultimately this. The people who moderate their drinking, my contention is that they don't really realize they're doing it. Okay? They're not exercising a whole lot of willpower. They just simply moderate their drinking, right? They have their 1 drink or their 2 drinks and they're satisfied, and then they stop. Okay, they go about their business. They move on to the next chapter of whatever the social occasion is or whatever. And so, because the neural adaptations just haven't taken root yet by virtue of the lower level of quantity and frequency and time, and probably also a lower level of their affinity for alcohol, they're just, like, they're not really trying to moderate. They're just doing it. So here we are, presumably if you chose to watch this video, it means you probably had some level of interest in moderating your drinking. And if it's something that you've been wrestling with, and Lord knows I wrestled with it for years, and I tried as hard as I could to force a square peg through a round hole, to figure out how, by golly, I'm gonna rein this in, because I like drinking and I ain't gonna give it up. So I'm gonna figure out how to just do it less. And, if you think about when you go to a restaurant, right? You go to a restaurant, you order a meal, they bring you your entree, you have your 1 plate of food, you eat it, you're finished eating, and then you're done. I mean, maybe you'll order a dessert, but most of us are probably not going to go, okay, I want to get a 2nd plate of food, and then a 3rd plate of food, right? I mean, if you had an eating disorder, you might do that. Right? You might really have to exercise some significant self-discipline to stop at 1 plate of food. But if that's you, that indicates there's probably something, amiss here, right? There's a disorder here. There's a problem in your relationship with food. Well, similarly, when it comes to your relationship with alcohol, if you have to exercise that much willpower to stop at 2 drinks or stop at 3 drinks, if it's that hard for you, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you or that there's any sort of moral failing here. All it simply means is that you have a higher affinity for alcohol, maybe than some other people, and on top of that, you nurtured that with a higher degree of consumption, quantity and frequency, over an extended period of time, such that your brain now, once that first drink rolls in, has gotten so damn efficient at processing it that the effects you get are so diminished that you need more, and then you need more, and then you need more. And once that more and your blood alcohol level creeps up, as we all know, our good judgment diminishes, and then your ability to have any sort of discipline about the situation, very easily slips out the window. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one concept that can be almost like a siren song out there that can really sort of confuse us and give us false hope about this matter. And that's what I call moderation mirages. So if you're struggling to rein in your drinking, you maybe set some boundaries for yourself, but you blow those boundaries. You break your own rules regularly. If you really buckle down, by golly, I'm gonna do this. Like, whatever, New Year's resolution or whatever it might be. Okay, I'm gonna get a handle on this. And so there may be some period of time where you do have some degree of success. Okay, or maybe you have a couple of particular occasions where the circumstances lend themselves to sort of aiding you with your desire to moderate. And so I'm thinking of something like maybe you go out to a dinner with some colleagues and maybe your boss is there and you don't want to make a fool out of yourself, or you don't want to look like an alcoholic by drinking too much, so you keep it in check that night, and you have to drive home, so you're being responsible, right? So you have your one drink or your two drink, and the next morning you're like, see, I can do this. Look at that. I moderated last night. Or you went out to dinner with family, and you wanted to be really responsible that night, so you only had one glass of wine or one beer with dinner or whatever, and on that occasion, you succeeded, right? So the next day, pat yourself on the back. Nice job, self. See, what was I all worried about? I can moderate my drinking just fine. Okay, well, in very short order, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to blow your rules again. And that is because, again, the reasons that we cited earlier, the neural adaptations that take place, plus deep-rooted in your subconscious mind, psychological conditioning that you've created for yourself through the process of hundreds and probably thousands of drinking experiences, where you have embraced the belief that alcohol is a good thing. Alcohol is associated with pleasure and reward and fun and stress relief and relaxation, all these things that you've reinforced deeply down into your subconscious mind. You're not in control of all of those things. And you're certainly not in control of the neurochemical adaptations that have taken place. So when that alcohol flows in, you're not entirely in charge. That's the bottom line. And you do not need to be an extreme 10 out of 10 on the drinker spectrum who goes from drink one to blackout every time and has zero control. Okay, that's not the only definition of a problem in this realm. You may just be someone who wants to keep your drinks at 2 drinks, and you always end up going to 4 or 5, and you're frustrated with that. And maybe it's not a wrecking ball to your life. Maybe it's not, wrecking your health or anything. Like you're sort of limping along through life, but it's holding you back. And presumably the reason you are seeking the goal of moderation is because you recognize that. And what I'm here to tell you is that once you get past a certain point on the alcohol drinker spectrum, you're not going to move backwards, okay? You're not going to be able to go back to that point where you were able to moderate without thinking about it, without trying, without any willpower, like back when you were, whatever it was, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Okay, I'm sorry to tell you that ship has sailed, okay? You are about as likely to be able to rewind the movie of your drinking career as I am to grow new hair up top here. Whereas I promised you 20 years ago I had a thick head of, wavy locks, but they're not coming back. Okay, and that is because drinking, generally speaking, and our relationship with alcohol and our brain's adaptation to it is largely a one-way street, okay? And that one-way street consistently moves in one direction, and that direction is toward more, okay? more frequency, more quantity, more tolerance, okay? More fondness for the stuff. And generally speaking, at a certain point along that threshold, you're going to start having some problems. And that's why, presumably, you're interested in reining it in and moderating. I wish I could maybe tell you something different, but that's the reality. And I spent years trying to wrestle with that reality because I refused to accept it. And I can just tell you, as I said in the very beginning of this video, it's a common theme among folks who've gotten themselves into a certain threshold on the drinker spectrum who want to rein it in. It's a common theme to sort of, mythologize this holy grail of moderation that I just want to get to. I just want to be able to get to it. And it's a mirage. And so with that said, I'm going to wrap this up. If you're questioning your drinking and you're looking for resources to help you on your journey in exploring this and re-examining your habit, you can check out my website, sobermentum.com. Lots of great resources there. And there's lots of other great resources out there too. Get on Google, get on, a search engine, right here on YouTube. Look for some podcasts, okay? Look for some books out there. But take action, okay? I'm going to challenge you, take action, and take action today. Because if you've got an issue with this, it's not going to get better on its own. With that said, thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next episode of Sober Mentum Today.